My name is Bill Lane. I'm the co-president of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. My real job is I've worked for Caterpillar for 37 years. And I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition and why it is so important for American business and for American job creation. Let me just start out by saying this is a group that befuddles anyone we ever meet with. It's a coalition of 400, about 150 businesses, about 250 NGOs and faith-based organizations. In recent years, we've added 110 leaders of the U.S. military, all 3- and 4-star generals. This is a coalition that believes in the importance of smart power, that practices what we all believe we should, or not only preaches, but practices what we all believe how government should act. It's bipartisan, it's a sustained basis, and it gets results. Our leaders and our advisory committee includes Condoleezza Rice, who we just heard from, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz. Our leader in the state of Florida is Jeb Bush. We have activists in all 50 states. This is a terrific coalition. And when you go to these type of programs, and you always want to take away something you didn't know before, the thing I urge you to do is to go to the USGLC website, just type in USGLC. This is an organization you want to know about and you want to be involved in. Now let me just tell you why Caterpillar cares about foreign assistance. You know, as long as I've been there, 37 years, we have always believed in trade. And in fact, about 30 years ago, we used to pride ourselves with comments like, you know, we believe in trade, not aid. But you know, in some markets, if AIDS is ravaging the country, if there's malaria throughout the society, you can have all the trade in the world, and you're not going to have economic growth. When I started in 1975, we exported about half of what we made in the United States. And we exported to essentially one type of country, rich countries, oil-producing countries, Europe, Japan. Latin America was episodic. Much of the world was off limits because of the Cold War. Today, we export far more than half of what we make in the United States. But over half of what we export, we now export to developing countries. Countries we paid very little attention to 25, 30 years ago. Now, how does that correlate with assistance, with smart power? Well, let me give you one of the greatest examples of our generation, Plan Colombia. 12, 14 years ago, Colombia was on the verge of being a narco-terrorist state. It was near being a failed state. On a bipartisan basis, President Clinton, Speaker of the House, Denny Hastert, pulled together Plan Colombia. It was bipartisan, it was sustained, it was robust. At the time, we thought it was a pretty expensive program. It included civil society, it included improving the military. 12 years, 14 years later, we've got a thriving democracy. We've got a country that's our closest ally in Latin America. We saw 2 phenomenal presidents elected there in the way of President Uribe and Santos. And for a company like Caterpillar, one of our top 10 export markets today is Colombia. Peru's another one. Chile's another one. The importance of economies that we weren't really paying attention to 20 years ago are now driving our factories, resulting in more U.S. employment and getting results. Was it expensive? You know, at the time we thought it was really expensive. But when you put together all the money spent on Plan Colombia over the last 12 or so years, it equals about 3 weeks in Iraq. Now that's smart power. And that's why we have 110 3- and 4-star generals involved, because they know you have to have both hard and soft power to get results. Now, I have the honor to introduce one of the leaders of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, the director, Ambassador Mark Green. And one of the high points of my life was Speaker Hassler put me on a commission to look at foreign aid. It was the Help Commission. And we traveled, to all those places that you never get to go to, Haiti in the middle of the summer, and, you name it. But everywhere we went in Africa, the two things that really stuck out. One was George Bush was more popular in northern Uganda than he was in Houston. People in Africa knew what was going on. And I'm not sure George Bush got one vote for the legacy that he gave to the development community. But I can tell you, he saved tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives. The other point, just to reinforce, is he put some great people in various spots. Often when you think in terms of the Foreign Service or our ambassadors, you have political ambassadors and you have professional ambassadors. Well, wherever we went throughout Africa, we kept hearing about this young congressman. Mark Green was a 4-term congressman from Green Bay. Don't hold that against him. But he made it a point when they named him ambassador to Tanzania to make a difference. And he made a difference. And all I can say is one of my rules as a representative from Caterpillar, that I don't have to know 535 members of Congress. I need to know 10 people who are going to be important in 10 years. Our next speaker is going to be important very soon, much sooner than 10 years. Mark's already had solid accomplishments, and he's going to make a difference in the development of the world. I'd like to introduce Ambassador Mark Green. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill, for those kind words, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, we have a tough task ahead of us. First off, living up to Bill's billing and kind introduction, but also following, or trying to, the remarkable panel that we just heard. As you heard, is very clear, the Republican Party has a remarkable legacy in development and diplomacy. We've made it more effective, more efficient, more transparent, more results-oriented, and we've seen Republican leaders use that, wield those tools to lift lives and build communities in some of the poorest places in the world. From PEPFAR, the Historic AIDS Initiative, which has literally changed the course of human history, to the Millennium Challenge Act, which in fact has changed the entire way that we do development. But of course, that's just a precursor to what lies ahead. That's what brings us to this moment. Because the question that all of us care about, the reason that we're here in Tampa, is what's next? What exciting new chapter will we see a Romney administration take on and write in diplomacy and development? We've seen them embrace these concepts. We've seen them embrace American exceptionalism and being involved in providing leadership in this world. The question is, how will they use smart power, development, and diplomacy for what purposes and for what outcomes? Well, we're about to learn. I am very proud to introduce our panel of experts for you. These are insiders who can tell us about that chapter, what we might see, what we can expect, and what we can hope for. We have Rich Williamson, who currently serves as the Senior Advisor for Foreign and Defense Policy for the Romney-Ryan campaign, a veteran of the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations. He's also served a wide range of diplomatic posts, including Ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador to the UN Commission on Human Rights, and President George W. Bush's Special Envoy to the Sudan. Senator Kelly Ayotte is the junior senator from New Hampshire. She serves on the Armed Services Committee, the Budget Committee, the Commerce Committee, the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committee. In her brief time in the U.S. Senate, I think it's safe to say that she's become one of the most powerful and effective advocates for all the tools of power, defense, diplomacy, and development. And she argues that we need all these tools if we're going to be a force for good in this world, and if we're going to be truly safe and secure. We'll be joined shortly by Governor Tim Pawlenty, the former governor of Minnesota, who currently serves as the national co-chair for the Romney-Ryan campaign. During his time as governor, Tim led Minnesota trade delegations to countries including China, India, the Czech Republic, and Israel. He's also visited conflict and post-conflict zones in places like Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Earlier this year, he led an election observer mission to Tunisia. We have Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, a special advisor on foreign policy to the Romney-Ryan campaign. She formerly served as Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs in the George W. Bush administration and was responsible for issues like democracy and human rights and humanitarian relief efforts. She is currently a distinguished visiting professor of national security at the U.S. Naval Academy. We have Mitchell Reiss, the special advisor on foreign policy to the Romney-Ryan campaign. Mitchell brings a wealth of foreign policy experience, having served as Secretary Powell's Director of Policy Planning, Special Envoy for the Northern Ireland Peace Accord, and Special Assistant to the National Security Advisor. He is also currently the President of Washington College. And lastly, but most importantly, it's my honor to introduce to you our moderator for today's panel, KT McFarland. KT currently serves as a Fox News national security analyst and the host of the popular DEFCON 3 on foxnews.com. Her extensive knowledge and expertise in foreign affairs and national security comes from her time serving under 3 presidents, Reagan, Nixon, and Ford, and under Henry Kissinger as a key member of staff on the National Security Council. In 1985, she received the Department of Defense's highest civilian honor for her work in the Reagan administration. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel, and we're about to hear what's next.
You do not. You are free now. I give you full permission. Take off your jackets. If you like, loosen your ties. I also want to say that, this is a convention that we're all supposed to pay attention to the economy and jobs. And the good old Republican National Committee and all the groups, U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, et cetera, what have they done? They found a building way away from all the action. They brought us in. It's really hot, and they turned out the lights. So this is how we're going to talk about foreign policy. In the dark. We are waiting for Governor Paula, who is going to arrive, and then he will sit here. I'd like to recognize, though, we have Governor Weld, who has just walked in, former governor of Massachusetts, Romney mentor. We have seen in the previous panel about the legacy, Republican legacy in foreign policy. What we're going to do today in this panel is 2 things. One, we're going to talk about the future of Republican foreign policy and how Governor Romney might have a foreign policy if he's elected, but also we're going to take questions. So, and the way we're going to do them is not by you shouting. We're going to do them by you tweeting. So you're going to go to hashtag GOPFP, is that right? And then you're going to send your questions in there, and then somebody's going to hand them to me. Otherwise, it's just too complicated. They're mics, we can't hear you, so just send them that way, and we're going to show that we are, in fact, the Republican Party and the Twitter generation. We're going to talk about a Romney foreign policy, and I've been in 3 administrations, Nixon, Ford, and Reagan, and I can tell you that as a president comes in, whatever he may say on the campaign trail is not necessarily the foreign policy he's going to have. Why? Because events make the man. Issues make the presidency. So it'll be a little difficult for us to sort of jump ahead on what would a Romney foreign policy look like, except for the fact that we have the people on the stage who are likely to be delivering the Romney foreign policy. All these people, with the exception of the senator, have been named as potential Romney administration appointees. They were all on the road talking about Romney foreign policy, and the senator is going to be on the Senate Armed Services Committee, so she'll be deciding if in fact this is the right foreign policy to have. We are not going to talk about the military stuff, the defense budget, unless it comes in conversation. And it's for a couple of reasons. One, the American public is war weary. General Petraeus has told me, Bob Gates, Secretary of Defense, former Secretary of Defense, has said America's not going to get into another land war in the Middle East. We're moving out of that phase. We're ending the wars. So we're now going to look at a different kind of way of projecting American power and foreign policy. So we want to talk about three things. One, smart power. Now, smart power is talked about as soft power plus hard power. What is it? How would a Romney administration employ it? Second, economic power, economic competitiveness. How would a Romney administration use that as a focal point for repairing the economy, but also using it as a foreign policy leverage and power? And finally, that notion of American exceptionalism and America's role in the world. So, given those are three topics, we're going to try to have the conversation address those issues, and I'm going to start it by giving each one of our panelists a question, and then I will then have other questions, and we will take questions from the audience. But I want to point out, I am the mother of 5. I had a great career in government. We won the Cold War, and I'm retired. But I now know how to take comments, interruptions, criticisms from a whole lot of people at once. So we've asked the panelists to jump in however they would like and they see fit, whether it's the questions that we're discussing here or whether it's the questions that you send them, again, via hashtag GOPFP. So GOP foreign policy, okay? I'd like to start out with, let's see, Mitchell Reiss. You have had a long career in government in various administrations. You were the Director of Political and Military Affairs in the State Department in the Bush administration. And when we look back at the Bush administration, as we've just heard Secretary Reiss and others, some of the most unqualified successes that people say were just terrific, they restored America's position in the world, they were unqualified successes, were things like the Millennium Challenge, AIDS eradication in Africa. But we also know that we're in very different economic times when those policies were first instituted. So with all the talk about cutting the budget, we've got to balance the budget, we've got to deal with our deficit, what happens to those kinds of budgets in a potential Romney administration, Ambassador?
Well, thank you, KT, and I'd like to thank the host for inviting me here today. I am very pleased to be with all of you in Tampa. As KT said, I did work in the Bush administration, both Bush administrations actually. And one of the things that we always tried to do was to use the full array of foreign policy instruments that were available. Military power is important. It's really the bedrock on which a lot of our influence around the world rests, but it's not often the best instrument to use in the situation. And President Bush, to his enormous credit, and I still don't think he receives enough credit for it, launched the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS relief in Africa. It affected the lives of millions of people, all for the good. It was combined with an economic policy, the Millennium Challenge Account, which really looked at a new way of delivering developmental assistance, which wasn't just giveaways, with all the corruption and difficulty that that might entail. It was really challenging countries to see American aid in a new way. And we were leveraging the dollars that we were giving in order to force these countries to revise the way they did business, the regulatory and legal framework, transparency, anti-corruption. So we made sure that every dollar really had an outsized impact on the people that we were trying to assist. And I think part of that was even more successful than we realized, because as much developmental aid as we might be able to deliver, and I do think it's important because it's consistent with our values as an American people to help others who need help. I think what was most impressive about the Millennium Challenge Corporation was the fact that it teed up the private sector. It gave confidence to investors that they could put their money in these countries and they would be able to get a return on their investment if they were successful. And that's something that was not always the case in Africa, to put it mildly. So I think the combination of humanitarian assistance with PEPFARs economic development aid, very limited, very targeted, and then leveraging the enormous vitality of the private sector for foreign direct investment was a really successful formula, and I think it should be continued in a Romney administration.
So in other words, you're not going to cut those budgets in a Romney administration?
Well, as you know, KT,
should you choose to be in a Romney administration, if there is one, and if you're offered a job in the direction of American foreign policy in a Romney
the various
administration?
departments propose, and the Office of Management and Budget disposes, pursuant to congressional oversight, of course, which has to appropriate the money. All I really want to emphasize here is that this was a winning formula, and I don't think that it's received enough credit as it deserves.
Yeah, jump right in.
But if I may just add to what Mitchell said, because actually I do think it was is a very significant program. It did set forth a rather new model. Two elements that I just want to add to what Mitchell said was one, the fact that the countries that engaged in this, they came up with the ideas for the proposals. Why is that significant? Because they knew firsthand, whether it's in Latin America or Africa or elsewhere, they knew firsthand what kind of proposals specifically would be the ones in which their economies could actually grow. And then secondly, by actually investing monies in it, having the backing of the private sector, you also got a great deal of sustainability. I'm very familiar actually with a number of the programs which countries put forward, and they're very successful. They're sustainable because we didn't choose them. They actually came up with the ideas, and we worked with them.
Well said. I want to turn to Rich Williamson next. You can just look at him and you realize he's a hard power kind of guy. Most tough than me in that jaw. But you have said on a number of occasions that hard power is great, but it's got to be used in conjunction with soft power. That it's not one or the other, but both complement each other. Do you want to explain?
Sure, thanks, KT. Let me first acknowledge three of my fellow IRI board members who are here. Connie Newman, who was in the first panel, and former Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. Frank Fahrenkoff, former chairman of the RNC, and my dear friend Jim Colby, former congressman, and an expert, par none, on the foreign assistance issues. And thank the coalition and Mark Green and Liz for letting me be here. Look, I am uncomfortable with Professor Nye's delineation between hard power and soft power.
Why don't you explain who Professor Nye is and what that means?
Well, he unfortunately served in the Clinton administration. And
He's a Harvard guy. Yeah.
Unsuccessful in serving in the Obama administration, but he's a very smart professor at Harvard who's written many good books, and one of them was Hard Power and Soft Power, which gave a currency to this lexicon. And my view is the divisions aren't that simple, that there's a blend. And Governor Romney's made clear a handful of principles that show that blend. One, his deep belief in American exceptionalism, the things that have made America great, including the values on which we were founded and should continue to animate our foreign policy, which clearly continues with the compassionate assistance in foreign aid. Second, that America should lead, not from behind, whatever that means, but lead from the front. And what does that mean? It means leading using the full box of foreign policy tools. And they range from boots on the ground in one extreme to a whole range of diplomatic, economic, financial assistance, including being a leader on agriculture sustainability around the world, being a leader to help countries that are trying to get freedom by assisting their civil societies and democracy movements, being a leader with trying to help countries in transition move to sustainable stability and democracy, and helping those who are either victims of their own government's atrocity crimes against themselves or against or to be responsive to horrific natural disasters. That's all part of American exceptionalism, American leadership. And then the third leg, which I just have to note, which reflects what KT said, In the tradition of Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan, Governor Romney embraces peace through strength. The outliers in America's foreign policy since World War II are Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama. In the last 4 years have shown those don't work. So, KT, I think I don't like the distinction, but hopefully I've given some explanation of why it's important to be engaged and lead in the world, including in those areas where we help those less fortunate, help those countries in transition seeking freedom and democracy, and help those victims of atrocity crimes. Thank you.
Okay, all that is very well and good, except we have 3 branches of government. And whatever the Romney administration might propose has to then get through Congress. Senator Ayotte, I got to tell you, by the way, you were terrific last night. I think everybody who listened to you was really it's really just terrific to see somebody like you out there.
Except we're not talking about shoveling snow today. We'll talk more about foreign policy.
Look, when I was in the Reagan administration, some of the biggest battles that we fought were not overseas. They were over the Potomac River, and they were the State Department versus the Defense Department. That the Defense Department said, you know, we need a bigger budget and take it out of the State Department, and the State Department tried to take it out of the Defense Department. And so what happens? We've now had kumbaya, where the Secretary of Defense has said, gee, we really need to have a larger State Department budget. We need more foreign assistance, economic development, USAID, et cetera, et cetera. And the Secretaries of State and Defense really do get along really well in this administration. Now, what happens going forward? We're in tight economic budgetary times. How do you see that difference from Capitol Hill? These guys can propose all they want, but it'll be you who disposes.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, KT, and it's great to be up here with this distinguished panel. And I wanted to follow up on something that Rich said. I think the reason that you see now DOD and State Department coming hand in hand with leaders like General Petraeus, Admiral Mullen, and their successors coming forth and really advocating for the State Department budget is because it's not clear these distinctions between hard and soft power. And the two do go hand in hand when you think about them in terms of what we have in our toolbox to make sure that America is strong and to preserve our role in the world. And so that's why I think going forward that you won't see the types of fights we've seen in the past, regardless of the administration, because the two do work hand in hand. I want to touch on something that I've found that I think is a challenge where we do need leadership, and I've been very proud of Governor Romney on this point. That is, our foreign aid budget is 1% of the budget. But I can tell you that when I go out in a town hall meeting in New Hampshire, if I were to say to that group, when we're talking about the fiscal state of the country, we're not going to give any more money overseas, we've got problems here at home, I guarantee that I would get a standing ovation for that. But we all know that that's penny wise and pound foolish in terms of protecting our own country, that the more we are engaged overseas, particularly in the USAID budget, the things that President Bush did in Africa not only were reflective of our values, but gave us stronger relationships there. And I think that this is a case that leadership has to make. And Governor Romney, I've already seen him on the campaign trail making this very, very important point, not only about American exceptionalism. And as I look going forward, the thing that I know we're not going to spend a lot of time on today, but I want to mention it to every person in this audience, where we need leadership the most right now, is on this issue of sequestration. Because it's not only the Department of Defense, which I've spent a lot of time talking about, not only in New Hampshire, but throughout the country, where our own Secretary of Defense says we'll be shooting ourselves in the head. This 1% budget is going to be devastated as well, and it will result in the withdrawal of the United States from the world to the detriment of our safety. And so this is an issue please keep your eye on. I know all of you are in this room, but I also think this is an issue where the President as Commander-in-Chief has been very absent in terms of his leadership. and has not stepped forth and shown the type of leadership that needs to be shown on this very important issue. Because with that type of dramatic cuts in resources, we immediately pull back from places where, for example, go to Africa right now and look at the investment that the Chinese are making in Africa. And also look at the potential that is in Africa, but also look at the potential for the growth of Al-Qaeda in Africa. If we want to absent ourselves from those areas of the world, we will do so to the detriment of the safety of our country and also to the detriment of our values. So I see this as we will be committed to these resources under a Romney administration, and he will be someone who leads on this.
Okay, let me throw this out to Ambassador Dobriansky. You know, talking about American competitiveness and exports, particularly in countries like Africa and Latin America, we all know that one of the reasons, or one of the things that's going to be essential to revive the American economy is exports and access to resources. That means, and one of the major areas of growth is in the third world developing countries, but particularly places like Africa and Latin America, and to a lesser extent parts of Asia. But we have a lot of competitors, especially in Africa. We've seen the Chinese, where the Chinese will go and will basically buy your resources and here's the money, no questions asked. How would you deal with that?
I think there are three fundamental factors in which Governor Romney has been very explicit on. The first is here at this convention, premium is placed on the importance of the economy, and the economy, the domestic economy being a priority. You have to have strong economic leadership. What we do here at home matters, not only for us in terms of our own communities, in terms of our states and the country at large, but also in terms of our ability to engage abroad, the fortitude with which we're able to do that. So there's absolutely essential to have a very strong economic leadership with a plan, with the focus which is going to address many of the issues that are before us now. The world looks at us and looks to us for that. The second is the issue of innovation. Many of our companies and industries look for opportunities, and it's innovation that does create jobs, it creates opportunities, but you know the other incredible thing about innovation is that it also breeds many kinds of ties with other countries. There are many representatives here in this room from countries abroad, and in that sense, actually collaboration on innovation, innovation at home, really matters in terms of economic growth and global competitiveness. And then the third, and maybe also quite significant, is something that also Governor Romney has been also outspoken about, and that is that for global competitiveness, you need a fair playing field. You need to have a good set of rules and in which the global community will play equitably on. And in this case, we're talking about the problems with intellectual property rights. We're talking about currency manipulation. And in that sense, you need to have global responsible stakeholders economically. Those are, I think, the strong kind of foundation, and I think that's what you can see.
Jump right in.
Paula is absolutely right about fair trade, and we all know the governor is absolutely committed to making sure that there's a level playing field. But you're also going to need an administration that's committed to free trade. And this administration has been absent without leave. The Obama administration has not initiated a single bilateral free trade agreement in 3.5 years. Meanwhile, the Chinese have signed 9 bilateral free trade agreements in both Latin America and in Asia, and are in the process of negotiating 5 more. So again, for the United States to be able to harness the innovation that Paula talked about and our immense talent that we have here, you still need an administration that is going to fight on behalf of American workers and American businessmen to open up markets overseas. This administration hasn't done it. A Romney administration will.
And what's actually the most shocking is this administration has not even wanted trade promotion authority. I mean, that's a basic tool that a president needs, and this administration has actually said we don't want it. And the markets are overseas, and I look at just the state that I represent and the growth that our businesses just in New Hampshire have seen, even for the signing of the South Korean free trade agreement that waited too long, and to not be looking overseas when other countries are doing that really is to the detriment of our economy.
And as we know, may I say, as we know with that, in terms of how long it took on Korea, Thankfully, Panama and Colombia were in the mix.
That's right. That was incredibly important. But to say that we aren't going to reach out to the next markets and that the president isn't even looking for the type of authority that Congress would like to give him to do that is quite surprising because we want our businesses to have the markets of the world and to have the access to them in a free way and fair way.
And KT, if I could just add, Mitchell took the words out of my mouth. That was going to be my second part, but he said it so eloquently. Free trade does definitively matter. And I think the important aspect here, it's not just only good for the United States, but again, I think about many representatives who are here in this audience today. It matters to other countries. What's good about it, it's a win-win. It's not only a win for our national interest, but it is for other countries, particularly as you asked in the question about those developing countries. It gives them opportunities.
Okay, now I want to go back. Yeah, go right ahead.
This is a slightly different aspect, but something you raised, which is China's activities in Latin America, China, etc. And it brings to mind that we had a so-called Washington consensus under that.
Right, and they have the
that
Beijing
lasted
consensus
for a couple of decades, where there was broad consensus of free markets, space for civil society, and free trade. The combination of the financial crisis, China's rise, and the lack of leadership from Washington for the last 3.5 years have resulted in the so-called Beijing model being on the rise. And it's a model that says it's okay to have authoritarian regimes and get economic development. It's okay to crowd civil society, free speech, and other values we cherish, and you'll have economic development. It's okay to impose free trade. Well, this model is wrong. It's a model that, despite the economic growth in China, now faces enormous stress, as we see in this transition in China, where the people are demanding greater transparency and political participation. But it's also a flawed model for those in the developing world, because ultimately free markets, free trade, civil society will produce more prosperous growth in those underdeveloped countries. And the United States has the opportunity and obligation, not only with our financial assistance, not only with the innovation and strength of our companies, not only with the unmatched charitable contributions, which, by the way, are greater than all our foreign aid. The United States gives more money through charitable organizations and churches than our foreign aid. All these dimensions are important, but it needs political leadership in Washington who recognizes that individuals build those businesses, and they need free societies with free markets and free trade. And that failure of leadership in Washington that we've had for over 3.5 years has to end.
Let me follow up on something that you've all mentioned in one aspect or another, which is that when we give foreign assistance, we have certain, we want to get something for it, so to speak, from the United States, but we also want to develop these countries. What are you looking, when we look at the Middle East today, a year ago, the Arab Spring broke out and everyone thought, oh, this is great, democracy in the Middle East. They're going to have democratic governments, free elections, economic prosperity, and yet here we are a year later, where Egypt is now dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood and its government, its executive branch, its parliamentary, its military, increasingly Muslim Brotherhood influence in freedom of the press or lack of freedom of the press, and in working and having Muslim Brotherhood people in the governments of the local governments throughout Egypt. At the same time, we see something like Syria, where the Arab Spring didn't turn out that well. We don't know how it's going to end, but it certainly isn't very good right now. Would you take American foreign assistance and put strings on it? Should we be giving money to countries which are going to be developed, which are Muslim Brotherhood countries, which are talking about, on a frequent basis, abrogating the peace treaty with Israel, destroying American position throughout the world? They're part of the non-aligned movement. where would you be on stuff like that? Do you want something for your money? Okay, Senator, tell us.
Yes, I think that the answer is accountability always has to be with taxpayer dollars. And the reality is, I don't think, I would never support just wholesale giving money to countries without an understanding of where it's going, number one, what is it supporting, and what is the outcome going to be. And I actually think that's an area where we could do much better with our foreign aid dollars. We can give examples. Certainly we've seen with some of the examples of what's happened in Iraq, Afghanistan. How do we do this when we are actually working hand in hand with the military to make sure that the accountability is there for our dollars? And in the Middle East, yes, I think it's fair. It would be hard to tell the American people that we weren't looking at, okay, what is happening with your dollars? Are they being used to abuse human rights? Or are your dollars going to a place that support human rights, universal human rights for women? And I think those are important questions. But they also go hand in hand with the strength of America, this idea of peace through strength. Because I think we're in a much better position to be able to have those types of dialogues among leaders to say, yes, we will help you, but here are our expectations. We understand you're not us, but we also understand you aren't going to funnel money into things that undermine our values. So I think that has to be there, and I think you'll see more and more of that. I mean, there's grave concern in Congress, I can tell you right now, for example, on issues of Pakistan. How do we deal with the challenge of our relationship with Pakistan? And I think many of us who are strong promoters of making sure that we don't have an isolationist policy are still going to be asking those hard questions about when our dollars go, how are they used, and what is our relationship with that country?
The governor was very clear last fall in one of the foreign policy debates on the question of Pakistan. And he said our aid should be conditional, and he hasn't backed off that. But I think something else, since you were kind enough to raise the Arab Spring and the consequences, it goes again to American leadership. In that region of the world, what's the one country that's elected a non-Islamic president and has elected a non-Islamic majority in parliament? The only country where the U.S. has actively led, Libya, where we have been passive, crossed our fingers, held our breath, and hoped for the best. It hasn't turned out so well. And in some, like Egypt, the administration cut assistance for democracy work and civil society before the revolt in Tahrir Square. And let me just comment on Syria. This isn't speculation. Governor Romney made a statement a year ago plus that we should be in there working with the opposition, trying to help identify moderates and helping them organize. We are glad that 12 months later, Barack Obama followed Governor Romney's advice. Governor Romney 6 months ago called for helping to arm the moderate opposition. We are glad that President Obama signed a presidential directive to let 2 of the Gulf states do what we'd suggested, but we have less control over it now. And the 17 to 19 million who are dead are disappointed that President Barack Obama waited that long to follow Governor Romney's advice. You have to lead. You can't hold your breath and hope for the best. If you're risk adverse, whether it's in Iran or Syria, the risks will grow, the consequences will be more serious, and the options will be more difficult, and the result is eventual action will be more consequential and costly. This is a prime example why it's time to have someone who's smart, who's analytical, who embraces the American tradition and is willing to lead.
Let me just say, our lack of leadership, the president's lack of leadership in Syria is a travesty. So I appreciate your comments on that, because I think that also reflected in what we see happening in Syria is the failure of his reset policy. Because here we have Russia thumbing their nose in China when we have sought resolutions in the United Nations and continuing to provide those arms to the Assad regime to murder its own people. Now we have the Iranian regime also stepping up. And let's not forget, General Mattis, the commander of CENTCOM, has said, he testified before the Senate Armed Service Committee, that the single biggest strategic setback to Iran in 2 decades would be if the Assad regime would go. So the strategic importance, what we did in Libya was important, but let's not mistake the strategic importance to Syria in terms of the relationship with Iran. And the president has been absent on this, and I fully agree with the steps that the governor has identified. They are long overdue and should have been taken a long time.
Jump right in.
Katie, I'll make 2 comments. I'd like to identify myself with the statements made by the Senator and Rich. And 2 comments I'd like to make. The first is just on the point about Syria. I think that also one of the clear issues here in terms of the lack of leadership has been the virtual outsourcing of our policy to the United Nations. And when it's been clear, unfortunately, that the Security Council has not taken action, enhanced resolutions that would be benefiting the situation on the ground. The irony is actually the UN itself critiqued and criticized itself for its own lack of action, which was initiated by many other countries within. But the comment I want to come back to is your question about conditional aid or not conditional aid, and especially because this particular gathering is brought together, and I want to thank as well IRI, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, and one. And that is the role of NGOs, because many NGOs talk extensively about this issue. And I know that there are many here who, in the case with Egypt, and particularly with what was happening on the ground with regard to our NGOs in Egypt at the time, and not just only Egypt, there was great concern about how our foreign, our monies were going to be handled. Many NGOs had recommended that the Obama administration should not, earlier this summer, not give aid up front to the Egyptian military during this transition, because the argument was, don't do it until you see the transition come through. So the 2 points I'd like to make is, and especially because we are in this hall, and with the groups that are extremely active and helping on the ground, that kind of conditional aid does matter, and it is something that's quite important.
Why don't you guys go into a little bit more detail when you talk about the kinds of aid in the Arab Spring to nudge the process along, pro-democracy? We want to make sure that we're not giving money to people who are going to turn around and use it against us or our allies in the region. What kind of programs would you envision? Anybody?
IRI, International Republican Institute, has been in this business for a long time. It was launched from President Reagan's speech at Westminster Hall on June 8th, 1982. I was on a senior staff in the White House at the time. He made a very fundamental and important point about the importance of helping those who share our aspirations. And he said, we, quote, "We cannot determine the pace of freedom's march, but there should be no doubt our goal for all people, which is freedom, democracy." And in that speech, he outlined the value of giving those in the countries who want to have the tools to build civil society, to learn the instruments to have viable political debate, to how to put together political platforms, etc. And since then, the National Democratic Institute, chaired by Madeleine Albright, and the International Republican Institute, chaired for 20 years by our friend John McCain, have worked closely in countries all over the world. It is not a steady march. We saw this in Eastern and Central Europe, where there were progress, then setbacks, then progress. But you must have faith that all people in their heart hear the beat of freedom. They want to march to that beat, and we can help give them the equipment. And it's been a great honor and privilege to be on the IRI board, to be associated with Lauren Craner, the president, my colleagues on the board and others. And Freedom House does similar work. As I said, NDI, there are organizations in the NGO world and others who are active in helping civil society, not just to push the freedom agenda, but because people need that to have space to prosper within their own societies, to stand up to oppression, and they're better off, and dare I say, America is better off, and that's why we need consistent U.S. leadership.
I want to just seize on something that you've talked about. You were in the Reagan administration, I was in the Reagan administration. I think that Governor Romney is very much wants to associate himself with the Reagan administration and the achievements there, and it's kind of easy to remember because, you know, Reagan, Romney, Ryan, tall guys, dark hair, 2 syllables, starts with an R. In 1980, when the Reagan administration came in the years prior to that, in the Carter administration, the United States is in a very similar position than we are today, right? The economy was terrible. Interest rates were through the roof. If you wanted to buy a house or an apartment, you were paying almost 20% interest on your loan. The unemployment, we were in stagflation. President Carter talked about, you know, American malaise, that we had sort of lost our will, lost our place. And that was just a really gloomy feeling in the country. And to a certain extent, a lot of the problems we had then are much worse than even what we have today, because we have the looming threat of the Soviet Union. And yet, President Reagan, not only did he restore American defenses, the economy recovered, and then he won the Cold War without firing a shot. But one of the things he did that I think is one of the reasons he is now beloved by everybody, including the people who didn't like him at the time, is American exceptionalism. He talked about American exceptionalism. He made you believe in it again. And not in some sort of Peter Pan, Tinkerbell kind of way, where if you sprinkle a little fairy dust and you close your arms and you believe Tinkerbell's going to come alive. He had actual specific programs. One of the most upsetting things I've seen in the last period of time is last week there was a poll that said that the majority of the people, in fact the great majority of the people, feel that America is a civilization in decline. So that this election isn't just about who's going to be the next president for a few years, but about the whole direction of American civilization. And we have stopped believing in ourselves, Tinkerbell and Peter Pan aside. You've all talked about American exceptionalism at some point or another in your remarks today. What would you do? Talk is cheap. How would you put policies to it and have Governor Romney and a Romney administration regain, as Reagan did, that sense that America is the bright, shining city on the hill? And I'll just throw it out to anybody who wants to jump in.
Well, I think the first step is to get Governor Romney elected President of the United States. And then I think a whole number of opportunities open up. I think it really can't be said often enough the importance of leadership and the failure of this administration to explain to the American people what it's trying to do, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's domestically. All you hear day in and day out is this drumbeat of criticism of Governor Romney and the Republicans. There's no vision for the future. I think Governor Romney has an affirmative, a positive vision for the future, very much like Governor Reagan had in 1980. And I think it ultimately will win the day. And it is consisting of specifics on the foreign policy side. Free trade we already mentioned. Rich very eloquently spoke about a commitment to human rights, American values. The president, to go back to the Arab Spring, the president gave a wonderful speech in Cairo early on in his administration, and he's been silent ever since, cutting budgets, and I think quite shamefully leaving behind IRI employees to languish in Egyptian jails when our employees were bought their freedom to exit the country. $1.5 billion, and we could not get the young Egyptians who believed what we were telling them about the rule of law, democracy, and human rights. We abandoned them, and it's shameful. And these people still have the court case hanging over their heads. But again, the administration, it's not that surprising because they don't have a plan, whether it's for democracy promotion in the Middle East, whether it's for a Middle East peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, whether it's how to counter and prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Governor Romney has ideas and plans and policies for all of those things. Free trade, human rights, stronger defense, and again, a deep belief in the vitality of the American economy on which all of our influence overseas rests. So I think step number one, KT, is getting the governor elected president, and then good things will come.
I was just going to take a slice of that. I myself was in the Reagan administration at the National Security Council and also Freedom House and vice chair of the National Endowment for Democracy Board. And Mitchell mentioned human rights, and I really want to identify the point about values. Governor Romney has spoken very eloquently about the importance of values and this issue of human rights. We haven't seen leadership on this. When the administration, the Obama administration began, in fact, there was a kind of a tone set, I remember quite distinctly, and many groups were outspoken. This wasn't even a political issue. These are NGOs that came forward, were very disappointed in terms of not having that kind of leadership at the top, that inspiration in this particular area. And also, the issue of mixed signals in dealing with other countries in terms of not setting forth specific and clear set of lines as to, look, in our relationship, we have a political engagement, we have economic engagement, but you know what? Part of the package of engaging with the United States, we stand for something. We stand for freedom, for values. We have a moral foundation. And we want to engage with others who also can engage with us in those particular areas. So that's an area I think that's sorely lacking.
If I can, Frank Fahrenkopf and I had a dear friend, remains a dear friend, Senator Paul Laxalt, chaired that campaign in 1980. And he was kind enough to ask me to serve as his deputy of the National Reagan Campaign. And I feel echoes of that this year. The sophisticates said Ronald Reagan couldn't turn the economy around.
Yeah, oops.
I was doing a debate with that Marvin Kell moderated not long ago on an economic issue, which is out of my lane, was raised. And he said, everybody I know says you need to raise taxes. And I told him it reminded me of Clark Clifford after that election when he told somebody, I don't know how Ronald Reagan won, nobody I know voted for him. Well, the fact is that Ronald Reagan had success as governor, balancing an economy, moving a state forward. Mitt Romney is one of the great turnaround experts in recent history in the private sector and in the public sector, both in Massachusetts and the Olympics. He is speaking hard truths about tough decisions that will have to be made. But more importantly, in 1980, we had a president that thought it was the American people's fault and we were in malaise. And now we have a president who thinks he's managing our decline. The first step is to have a president who thinks his job is to remind the American people in the world that we have been, are, and will be forever a shining city on the hill, as long as we're faithful to our values and allow the American people to renew our economy and our society and build that future.
Go ahead.
I would just add, you know, we need, when you think about leadership around the world, to echo what Paula said, talking about who we are, standing up for human rights. And when you think about when the people of Tehran took to the streets and the president was silent, Ronald Reagan would have never allowed that. The reason he's... And here's the good news. Nor will Mitt Romney, because the reason that wall fell is because he stood there in that famous speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear that wall down. We have not had that type of leadership. We have not, in fact, think about it. When the people were in the streets in Tehran, silence. What's happening in Russia with human rights? He wants more flexibility. When it comes to our allies, they feel like we have left them behind. Think about the Poles, the Czechs, They were shocked when we backed off on missile defense. And yet, what have we got? More flexibility in terms of making sure we have strong, robust missile defense to protect us and our allies. And so I think that the president thought the power of personality with these folks was going to change people like Ahmadinejad and in Iran, where we all know that it's really only through strength and through clearly speaking about who we are and that type of American leadership that we can deal with individuals like the leaders in Iran. And so that's what we will see under a Romney administration, not afraid to speak up for who we are, not afraid to assert our values even when it's tough, and making sure, by the way, that we do have a strong military, because we are backing away from that. And if we do that, if we back away from our foreign aid and our military, people will not believe that we have the strength to be able to back up what we say.
This is the point at which we're going to start taking questions from the audience, but that doesn't mean you jump up and start screaming. What that means is you get your little BlackBerries out and your iPads and you start in the true forward-looking Republican Party of the future and use hashtag GOPFP, GOP Foreign Policy. Send us your questions, and then somebody's going to hand me the little cards and I'm going to ask them. So, let me go back to one of the things that one of you said about Governor Romney, to turn around artists. He takes problems and he turns them around and solves them. But he uses the private sector to do it. You're all also talking about Ronald Reagan. Well, Ronald Reagan's idea of government was, you know, the scariest words in the English language. You're not from the government, I'm here to help you. His idea of government was get out of the way and let the private sector deal with it. So talk to us about the need for the private sector to cooperate or work with or even supplant the government in development. What would a Romney administration, how would a Romney administration work with business in global development?
I think that you can expect great activism in this area. The private sector in all different sectors, whether it's businesses, whether it's non-governmental organizations, whether it's faith-based communities, you name it, they have a role to play. The earlier session and panel focused on the whole issue of compassionate conservatism, and it was talking about foreign assistance, about health-related issues, a whole variety of issues. There are so many different sectors in which the private sector can play. Just take that one lane. It is actually the private sector that has done a phenomenal job in terms of having greater access than the US government in getting antiretrovirals to very rural areas, which need to be deployed. It's also the private sector that also has, in many cases, a base. It is the face of the United States in many ways abroad. So this is just one area. No less economically, we were talking about the importance of economic power and how crucial opportunities for businesses are. I think that it's absolutely essential that as businesses are doing, they're bringing their ideas forward. And those ideas are the ones that are on the cutting edge. Those are the ones in which need to be supported, particularly in the area of innovation. So these are just two examples, but really can make a phenomenal difference in terms of, if I may use that term, soft power.
Yeah. If I could just, Katie, as I noted earlier, more impact on economic development in the world comes from private sector initiatives. The charitable contributions of the American people, especially through faith-based, but not only faith-based organizations, dwarfs our foreign aid. And we have an administration that somehow thinks profits are a bad thing. Success should be punished. And people who build that should be denigrated. You'll have a president.
Well, wait a minute. People who build that, you didn't build that. Isn't that the whole point?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
He doesn't,
sorry for the bad joke.
but those who build that are not part of the circle embraced. And we will have a president that understands that charitable contributions are important, Just look what Mitt Romney personally gives. We'll have a president who understands the power of free enterprise in the private sector. Look how he's devoted his life. We'll have a president that understands that Pfizer doing work on AIDS in Uganda, Caterpillar in China, and other companies, Monsanto and Agricultural Development, are making vital contributions every day. They're our partners. We want them to succeed. We want them to flourish because we share a vision that growth across the globe is good for the globe and it's good for the American people.
You know, one of the areas also quite interesting, which corporations especially have gotten in, because you're mentioning a number of corporations, what has really been impressive is the fact that they only haven't stayed in their own lane, whether it be in agriculture or otherwise, but they've taken on issues that matter to all of us, like the issue of trafficking in persons. I have to say it's incredible, the dedication, the investment that many companies make, and they look at these issues and what they do not only in the United States but also abroad in trying to work with other countries, educate, work together to combat literally human rights abuses such as that one.
Can I also add, I think that when you look at what's being done by the private sector, they can hit a problem faster, more efficiently, with a better return on investment. And so I know that the Governor Romney will be making those types of partnerships that enable the private sector to use what they're best at, the innovation, the problem-solving skills, and frankly not hampered by a lot of the bureaucracy in Washington to really get problems solved. And that's why it can be a partnership, so we can leverage taxpayer dollars, but also leverage that expertise in the private sector.
We've just got 5 minutes to go, so I want to throw in a question about Governor Romney has talked about, well, he certainly lived his life as one of service. He's emphasized that with his own life, his children, his missionary work, etc. Do you see Governor Romney talking and embracing some notion that American young people, half of whom are unemployed, by the way, should go do good deeds? Should they join the military, Peace Corps, work in the National Park Service, Teach for America, or go abroad with NGOs? How would you deal with that notion of an American commitment that the American kids should spend 18 months of their life doing something for others? Please.
Well, I think it's important to look at a leader's own life. This is a man who left Stanford to spend 2 years as a missionary, knocking on 200 doors a day, having 199 closed on him, but having the perseverance in service to his faith to try to help others. This is a person who gives tens of millions of dollars every year for charitable efforts. This is an individual who's had 5 sons, each of whom have done missionary work. This is an individual, when one of his co-workers' daughters disappeared and it was feared that she was kidnapped, shut down Bain, took every employee to New York. They went out and passed hand-to-hand flyers about this girl, went door to door and helped recover this child who'd been taken. This is a man who, like George H.W. Bush, doesn't go around patting himself on the back, but has had a life of service. And just as the founder of 1,000 Points of Light did for America, he will show and be committed that that value regain strength and animate his administration in the United States of America.
I think that's a great note on which to end this conversation. These people, Ambassador Mitchell Reiss, Paula Dobriansky, Williamson, and Senator Ayotte. They've all made a pretty firm commitment that in a Romney committed to the kind of restoring the shining city on the hill and using non-government organizations and foreign assistance and economic development that is good not just for the rest of the world, but in fact is good for America. So thank you all for that, and you're going to be held to your promises. Thank you.
Sounds like a great place for me to step in. One more time, a round of applause for our panelists. And of course for KT McFarland. Well, we had a great couple of hours. The first panel began with Mike Gerson talking about the different approach to development and diplomacy as a result of the principles that President Bush brought to bear: accountability, a market-oriented approach, transparency. We heard all the justifications for these tools: national security, economic growth, and of course an expression of our moral values. In this panel, we've had Rich Williamson talk about how American exceptionalism, which is obviously at the heart of Governor Romney's campaign, but how American exceptionalism and these tools that we're talking about are intertwined. They must go hand in hand. Senator Ayotte has warned us of the dangers of disproportionate cuts to this area, about what would happen if we lose that 1%, what that would do to our interests and voices around the world. So I think you see a Republican Party engaged. I think you see a Republican Party that believes in American leadership. I think you see a Republican Party, Republican leadership that will stand with people around the world who are yearning to be free. In quick cleanup duty, I want to make sure that we thank, on behalf of U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, once again, our partners, one, in the International Republican Institute. I also want to say that Governor Pawlenty, who's obviously not up here, was sidetracked, couldn't make it here, but I want to invite you to go over to the Tampa Club for 4 o'clock, where he'll be engaged in an event with the Foreign Policy Initiative, a conversation with Tim Pawlenty. And I also want to make sure that our international visitors who are here, part of the program, I'm told that you are to, and I'm quoting, "Please exit the first door on your right outside the theater to get to your buses." Important instructions, no doubt. Once again, thanks to all of you for coming and your interest. Thanks to our panelists and the program. I think we've had a great time indeed. Thank you.
Yes.